the newsagents.
Tonight, with rising tensions in the Middle East, will there be an all-out war after the dangerous escalation between Israel and Hezbollah already? The moment one of hundreds of airstrikes slamming into a neighborhood in southern Lebanon. Israel saying they struck 1,300 Hezbollah targets. Officials say nearly 500 are dead tonight.
There is that dreaded word, which is in virtually all of the news coverage at the moment about the situation in the Middle East, and it is escalation. Escalation potentially leading to full-blown war, not just between Israel and Hamas, but between Israel and Lebanon.
So today we wanted to take you back, ask about the group that are right at the centre of this conflict right now, Hezbollah, somewhere between a political party and a paramilitary group, and ask how they began, what their endgame is, and what's actually happening there now. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's Emily. It's Lewis.
And somebody has come back from the party conference with what we're just going to call euphemistically a sore throat.
A sore throat. Well, I'm just trying to... It sounds like Gillian Anderson is playing you again.
Well, what I love about this is we're not even done yet on the party conferences. If this is what your voice is sounding like today, Wednesday, where we still have a full session to go in Birmingham, no less.
Hey, at least I made it in. Where's John Sopel?
Well, that question will be revealed a little later. Do not fear, listeners. He is not entirely absent from today's episode.
Yeah, and obviously we've been focusing a lot on what's been happening at the Labour Party conference this week. But as we were saying yesterday, there has been, it felt in Liverpool like the real story was elsewhere. And the real story has been and will continue to be in the Middle East. Further developments overnight. Israel bombing the mountains north of Beirut in Lebanon, and Hezbollah, the paramilitary group, the state within the state, as Emily was saying, targeting Tel Aviv for the first time on Wednesday, basically in just a further expansion of the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, who, you know, they have fought many times over the decades, most recently, of course, in 2006. Now, as a result of all of these attacks, the British government has advised all British nationals and dual UK Lebanese nationals to leave the country while there are still commercial flights available. And indeed, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, went on television to basically tell people in southern Lebanon to leave in a way that was quite reminiscent of how they handled things in Gaza, to leave any site which could be adjoined to or next to a Hezbollah military site. But here is Netanyahu making that television address.
I have a message for the people of Lebanon. Israel's war is not with you. It's with Hezbollah. For too long, Hezbollah has been using you as human shields. It placed rockets in your living rooms and missiles in your garage. Those rockets and missiles are aimed directly at our cities, directly at our citizens. To defend our people against Hezbollah strikes, we must take out those weapons. Now, starting this morning, the IDF has warned you to get out of harm's way. I urge you, take this warning seriously. Don't let Hezbollah endanger your lives and the lives of your loved ones. Don't let Hezbollah endanger Lebanon. Please, get out of harm's way now. Once our operation is finished, you can come back safely to your homes.
Yeah, and I guess that brings us back to your word escalation, because a lot of the news coverage today will be saying, are we on the brink of war? Are we going to all-out war? Is this war? And actually, for anyone who's kind of more embedded in the Middle East right now, they'll say, I don't know what you're waiting for. We are in this war. This war is already happening. The shelling is happening. The explosions are happening. People are being targeted. Civilians are being killed. As we said yesterday, over 550 people were killed in Lebanon on one night. And I think the toll is now about 50 of those as children. I mean, the death toll is already horrific. But the question that we're trying to ask, I think, today is not where it all began, because that probably takes us back centuries, but where the modern incarnation of Hezbollah begins. And that is essentially a group that is somewhere between politics and paramilitary, born out of Israel's invasion and occupation of Lebanon. Israel invaded in 1982 and it didn't leave the south. And so this group, which you very rarely hear mentioned without the phrase Iranian-backed coming straight after it, was basically a guerrilla war unit which made its presence felt to the Americans by killing service personnel at a Navy base, by killing diplomats in the US Embassy in Beirut in the 1980s. And this all kind of came as a result of Lebanon's civil war. And they do have a sort of extraordinary litany. If you look back at the things you can lay at the door of Hezbollah, the very beginnings of the idea of suicide bombing, which began, many people think, with this group, that somehow you would turn what you needed to do in paramilitary terms into an ideology, and that ideology fits with the group's name. Hezbollah means the party of God. It goes right back to a phrase in the Quran, and essentially that is what they are fighting, not just Israel, not just America more widely, but fighting for something that is deeply connected to the Shia arm of Islam. And they have found themselves with a certain amount of proper public support. In Lebanon, they have parliamentary seats, they have a very persuasive voice, in the Lebanese government. And I guess this means that when Israel is attacking Hezbollah, the line is blurred because we don't know whether they are attacking a purely terrorist group who's done fundamentally horrendous, atrocious things, or whether they are attacking part of what the Lebanese people would call their own state.
This is the sort of the binary nature of this group, right? Yeah. Which is that on the one hand, they are considered a terrorist organisation by, for example, the United States government, the British government. Yeah. They've got deep-rooted military alliances with very anti-Israel states like Iran and Syria.
$400 million, dollars coming in from Iran.
Absolutely, financially back to the hilt in military terms and all those sort of things. In a way that Hamas has come to be, but Hezbollah a much more powerful group. And these cross-border clashes as a result between Hezbollah and Israel, have been taking place on and off for decades, occasionally flaring up into full-blown war, which we're basically seeing at the moment. And yet at the same time, they are a political party, they're a Shiite political party, and they basically run Southern Lebanon. I mean, if you ever, I've reported from there, when you go down to Southern Lebanon, it is extraordinary. As soon as you sort of get into that part of the country, you see Hezbollah officials everywhere wearing their sort of yellow shirts, which is what they're sort of notorious for wearing. You see flags across the area. It is a state within a state. Yeah. And so it is a complicated organisation in an already really complicated country. Lebanon's politics is really, 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 really complex. And it is, in many ways, more powerful than the beleaguered and enfeebled Lebanese state itself. Yeah. So it is a complicated organisation with a sort of complicated set of objectives.
Yeah, and I think it's been about 15 years since Lebanon's own cabinet, the new cabinet then, in 2008, approved a policy statement that actually recognises Hezbollah's existence as both an armed organisation and as a body that is trying to liberate or recover occupied lands. And I'm trying to find a sort of equivalence to that, and it's really complicated. You cannot imagine saying, yes, we know that you're a paramilitary organisation, but we are such fervent believers in what you're trying to do that will kind of allow you to be recognised as a body itself in our parliament. And so this is where it gets really complicated in terms of trying to work out what full-blown war looks like as opposed to a fight against an insurgent or a terrorist organisation. Joining us now is the historian James Barr, who's written extensively on the Middle East and is currently a visiting fellow at King's College in London. And James, if we wanted to ask you about the incarnation of Hezbollah now and how it began, what have we seen? What is the development of this group?
That's a great question. I mean, so I suppose the first thing to say is that, of course, Hezbollah grew out of Israel's invasion in 1982. They didn't exist back then, but they were created as a result of it. They rose out of that. So that, I think, is quite important because, of course, Israel invaded to try to deal with the threat of Palestinian terrorism because at that time, of course, Lebanon was deep in a civil war. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, used Beirut because it was so chaotic. It made a perfect base for them. And in 82, Israel decided it had to invade. And Hezbollah grew up out of that. It was formed with the backing of the Iranians in the 80s, and obviously gradually grew as it sort of established itself as the primary source of resistance to Israel into the 1990s and then the 2000s.
James, bringing it up to date, what does Hezbollah do in terms of its political role in Lebanon today?
So if you go to South Lebanon, I mean, it's the most extraordinary place. I went fairly soon after the 2006 war, and it's a bit like a state within a state. And of course, Lebanon itself is a bit of a failed state in itself. But if you go there, if you go right down into the south, it's a sort of a mini Iran, and you've got pictures of the Ayatollahs hanging off every lamppost and pictures of people that they would describe as martyrs who fought for Hezbollah and died in its service. At that point, this was just after the war, all the roads down there had been attacked by the Israelis when they invaded in 2006. And a year later, they'd all been patched up. And that was very, very, the sort of contrast between that and elsewhere in Lebanon was very stark, because elsewhere in Lebanon, the place was still completely smashed by that war. But down in the south, Hezbollah had fixed stuff very, very quickly to ensure that it didn't lose local support. And that is what it's all about. And that is why it's such a powerful and it's a serious threat, because it is deeply embedded in Lebanese society. It is not just a terrorist organization in the sense of people with guns and bombs. It is, it provides education, health services, all that sort of thing. It's absolutely part of the community in a country where the state is often failing to supply those things.
And what are its aims? What does it want?
Well, it's committed to wiping Israel off the map. It doesn't hide that. But of course, in practice, it has trodden more carefully. It has to operate in quite a complicated space, because obviously if it hits Israel too hard, then it invites very large-scale retaliation. And that in turn makes other people in Lebanon, the people not Shiites and don't support it, obviously they become more hostile to it. So it's been quite constrained. It's got Iran also pushing it. The Iranians are thought to supply it with anything up to about, I think, $700 million every year in support. And they want it to act as a deterrent, to press Israel. But Hezbollah is quite constrained in what it can do because of its need to survive in Lebanon itself.
James, you paint a really interesting picture of this group that on the one hand is insurgent and on the other has actually woven itself very much into the fabric of southern Lebanese society. They have parliamentary seats. Presumably there is love for Hezbollah amongst certainly the Shia community there. What is the relationship that it has with other parliamentary groups? I mean, what you'd call the Lebanese state, or doesn't that really exist at the moment?
Well, it's hard to say, and people are very, very wary. I was listening to somebody this morning on the radio, and it was an aid worker who was asked to really comment on much the same thing, and she was working out of the southern town of Merjayoun, which is close to the Israeli border, but she was completely unwilling to criticise Hezbollah. And I think that gives you a kind of idea of, the influence that it has and the threat it can wield over other parts of Lebanese society. So, there's plenty of people there who in Lebanon who are by no means pro-Hezbollah. And if anything, the group is now more unpopular than it was back in 2006 when it was seen to have stood up to Israel and, won that war. Now it is not as popular, but it is still very powerful. And as you say, I think it's got 40 MPs in a parliament of just over 120. So, it's a very powerful bloc.
If there were to be another war, a la 2006, what do you think it would mean for Lebanon and for Israel?
Well, I think there is a war. I think it's already happening now. It might be that Hezbollah is not fighting back, perhaps because it just can't, because of the strikes last week. both the pager attacks and then the strike on Friday. But the war has started. I think it will be chaotic for Lebanon. It's a state that obviously is still reeling from that the explosion that happened in the port of Beirut in 2020, which was an enormous explosion, but I think devastating for the confidence of Lebanese people, who are generally, I always think, there are people who bounce back. I'm always amazed when I meet them, and that how resilient they are as a group of people. But that really, really hit them, and I think the prospect of a war causing devastation, similar to 2006, on top of all that, is now it's an appalling thought for a lot of people. On the other hand, Israel, is walking into a trap that it walked into in 1982. It invaded in 1982 thinking that it would be able to deal with the problem of terrorism, that it would make Israel a safer place. And it was 18 years before they got out, and Hezbollah was one of the results of that. So there's a sort of degree of almost triumphalism in what the Israelis are saying at the moment. They're obviously keen to try and follow up what they've done in the last few days. They think they've got Hezbollah on the run, but Hezbollah is so deeply ingrained in Lebanese society that Israel will find itself fighting a war amongst the people. And I think the lesson of the last 20 years is that kind of war is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to win
because of the civilian deaths. James, just let me ask you on the question of funding, because we hear so much about Hezbollah, and I guess some of it will come from places that want to tell the story of Hezbollah as the the trafficking gangs or drugs gangs or the gun running or whatever. Do they get all their money essentially from illicit, illegal profiteering, or is most of it from Iran, or is that the same thing?
I think most of it comes from Iran, but I'm not an absolute expert on this, I have to admit, on the financing. But I think Iran is the single biggest provider of money. But there's no question, if you go to Lebanon, it does have a slightly Wild West feel when you drive down the road and you see like lots of bits of half Mercedes kind of that you could buy and have bolted together. It is a country where groups like that can flourish because the rule of law is pretty weak.
Well, I may have left my voice in Liverpool.
And your heart.
And my heart, of course.
And probably either your wallet or your microphone or
Right,
something,
Mum.
or your wash bag.
Okay, Mum. But the Labour Party conference actually concluded today, and it actually ended on a pretty big embarrassment for Keir Starmer and the Labour leadership, which is that in very early days of this government, they have already lost a vote on the conference floor. This was a motion which was brought forward by Unite, obviously one of the largest unions, and their General Secretary, Sharon Graham. All week they had been manoeuvring behind the scenes to try and get a motion on the floor which called on the government to reverse course on winter fuel. They did manage to get it on the floor today rather than yesterday. Labour leadership prevented it being on the day of the Keir Starmer speech, but it happened today anyway, and the Labour leadership lost it. This was Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of Unite, in a rather jubilant mood, having won that vote.
Friends, let's hold up our heads and be proud to be Labour. Let everyday people know we are on their side. Let's put our arms around the working class and make lasting change. Solidarity, I move.
Now, the vote is non-binding. The government don't have to act on it, but it is an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment for the end of the conference, and it is not. We talked all week about it being a sort of slightly flat conference. That's probably the most exciting thing to have happened in it, and it's not ideal headlines for the end of conference to be dominated by a loss of a loss on the vote about an issue which continues to wound the government and its politics.
So on Sunday night, when I arrived in Liverpool, I found myself in a lift with a very senior Labour figure, and I realised I only had the number of floors that before they got out to ask the question I needed to know. There was just two of us in the lift. And so I said, what's happening to the vote then? Because at the beginning of the week, we thought that vote might be on Monday.
Yes.
And this person said to me, it's now Wednesday. In other words, the Prime Minister will have gone by then. He'll be out of the way. He'll be on to bigger things. He's at the UN General Assembly in New York. In other words, they knew it was going to be embarrassing. They knew they were going to lose it. And the best they could do was, if you like, hide it on day 3 once the Prime Minister had exited the building, because Now, it may be a sort of headline for Unite, and I'm sure it will be a headline for Unite, but it won't be something that the Prime Minister directly has to respond to. And I think there was that moment in his speech where he preempted this idea that he would lose the vote and said, that's how it is. It's going to be painful. Sorry, you know this. As did Rachel Reeves. They both spoke to the fact that nothing was going to change their minds on this, because that is part of the narrative.
Yeah, I think, as I say, although it's not binding, I think it is revealing in one sense, which is that up to now, one of the hallmarks of the Starmer leadership has been an increasing iron grip on the machinery of the Labour Party.
Right.
And it has now controls the NEC, the National Executive Committee. It's basically controlled everything at conference, and it has had, slow process of wresting back control from the left, and they're running large. This is the first time you've really seen a crack from some years in that kind of Starmer control. And I think what it shows us is, look, Starmer and Reeves have been saying since they came to office, we're going to have all these hard decisions, we've got all these tough choices. The appetite within the Labour family and within the Labour Party to actually make good on those tough choices is so limited, because let's remember, winter fuel, it's emotive, obviously, whenever you're talking about pensioners and talking about fuel, talking about energy costs and poverty and so on. Of course it's emotive, but it's not winter fuel payment's been there since the late 90s, worth 200, 300 quid a year. It's like not one of the centerpieces of the welfare state or anything, right? This is not something like Beveridge came along with trying
NHS,
to do.
yeah.
No, exactly. So there is such institutional resistance within the Labour Party, within the PLP, within Labour Conference, to do this relatively modest thing, then frankly, I think the appetite for doing much more is going to be very is not there, and it's going to be difficult for them if they press ahead with other big changes.
Well, the flip side to that, perhaps, is something that kind of went under the radar a little bit in the conference, because it's not a particularly easy story to tell, but it's about Rachel Reeves and borrowing going into the budget. And what we heard from the Chancellor on Monday was just the hint that she might be able to tweak or twiddle her fiscal rules to allow for more borrowing to invest. And in the last hour, the chief economist of the OECD, Alvaro Pereiro, has said that the UK's fiscal rules could be counterproductive. They understand they're meant to keep the government debt in check, and this is all, part of responsible governing. But the fact that the OECD is now saying, actually, let's not be too hard and fast about this, some of those rules could end up being counterproductive, may help tell the story that Reeves is almost certainly dying to tell, which is there is more room to borrow. There is the chance that it won't all just come in the terms of horrendous, cuts and tax rises. There is the chance that we will be able to take on more debt and spend more.
As I was saying yesterday, I think actually the most significant moment of Labour conference was not in Starmer's speech. It was that actual just one line in Reeves' speech on Monday, where she alluded to the idea of changing the Treasury mindset on investment and debt to consider a change, or to hint at a change, where you would say that investment debt, which is used for investment and for capital, is not the same.
It's totally different, exactly. And that's why it's never borrowing, it's always borrowing to invest. And the line that Pereira uses is, the UK's existing rules may tend to short-termism and the potential deterioration of public finances in the long run. In other words, it's a kind of benediction, from a very senior, very well recognised body, the OECD, Economic Development, Organisation for Economic Development, and it's basically saying, you have our blessing to do what you need to do to make sure that actually your public finances are not hurt.
Well, look, lots of economists from left to right would agree with that, and have been saying it for a long time. It is the reason I think that line in Reeves' speech was significant is because it is she herself who has been so religious to a particularly austere version of fiscal rules, right? The Jeremy Hunt inherited fiscal rules. She has put a great deal of political capital on sticking to them, and I think it was significant this week that she hinted that could be about to change. Maybe not changing the rules as such, but changing the mindset on the way that the Treasury considers that sort of investment.
We'll be back in a moment with news of our long-lost colleague. Well, there was fevered speculation in the office today when we knew that they were about to announce the new editor of the Spectator magazine, and John Sopel was nowhere to be seen. How tongues wagged. But in the end, it wasn't to be.
No. Narrowly missed out.
Narrowly missed out to Michael Gove.
To Michael Gove.
Who will take over from Fraser Nelson as the next Spectator editor.
A return to journalism for Michael Gove.
Yes.
Which is, I mean, there had been a lot of speculation about whether he would become the editor of the Times.
Yep. He's going to do a Times column.
He's going to do a Times column. Obviously, Gove had been a Times journalist for many years and had been a successful journalist. And before he went into politics, a widespread expectation that he would be a newspaper editor, probably of the Times. Paul Marshall, as we've been talked about on the show before, the GB News backing millionaire, has bought the Spectator. Marshall and Gove are close allies, close friends. And so perhaps not a surprise, but what it does remind us is that Gove is, or what we learn from this, is that Gove is going to continue to be a big player in Conservative politics because the Spectator is kind of like the in-house Bible in a lot of ways for a particular type of conservatism, traditionally slightly more liberal conservatism. But so Gove is going to remain a player in Conservative politics, which not all Conservatives will be pleased about, it has to be said.
And not just the Bible, but a sort of a grooming zone for future Tory politicians. I mean, don't forget, he's doing it this way round, but Boris Johnson went from being the editor of The Spectator to being, MP and then Prime Minister.
And Gove is a very close ally of Kemi Badenoch. So if
there is a cover imminently shouting its support for Kemi Badenoch, that would all make sense.
Indeed so.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.